Hello and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is SIG API Machinery Kubernetes bi-weekly meeting. My name is Federico Bongiovanni. We have a short agenda today, but nevertheless, it's going to be great. So thank you, Shane, for bringing the topic and for joining the meeting. I will leave it to you to start it.
Sure, sounds good. I have been at these meetings before in the past, but I'm usually not very vocal. Just in case it's helpful, since there's so many people on the call, to introduce myself. I'm shaneutt. I work at Kong on Kubernetes networking. I'm also a maintainer of Gateway API, which is a big part of the perspective on what I'm going to bring up today, and a chair of SIG Network. In Gateway API, we have this concept of policy attachment, which we would probably characterize it as very useful and necessary for a variety of networking related things that we need to do, but also problematic because of how references between objects work with policy attachment today. The biggest drawback of, let me actually go back and define, and then I'll talk about the drawbacks. You can have an HTTP route, which is, if you're familiar, kind of analogous to like ingress, an ingress resource in Gateway API. That's the closest parallel. And this can say that I do HTTP traffic, and like this path goes to this backend. We have this concept of meta resources and policy attachment, where you can have another resource that, sorry, one sec. I'm gonna turn my phone off because it's being noisy. Where you can have another resource that is influencing the underlying configuration, like on the data plane, the actual routing, the mechanism. And hopefully that's clear enough. If there are any questions, please do raise your hand at any point if you want to interject or ask questions. But the biggest drawback with that today is we wanted to have that be something where the resources are actually defined in the specification of the resource that is affected by them, because that seems more declarative and more clear to users. But what we have today in an experimental state is unfortunately not that. It's more like there are problems with actually being able to find out what policies affect your HTTP route and so forth, because you have to have access to them, go search them. We can do some things with status, but I think everybody here knows that that's not always good for this kind of a thing. And that's kind of where we are at currently. Yeah, sorry, I should explain. A GEP is a gateway enhancement proposal. It is influenced. It's influenced by KEP and follows some of the same ideas, but it's meant to be I won't say that it always manages this, but it's meant to be a quicker, more iterative process with smaller PRs leading up to and going along several. It's similar. Anyway, so yeah, I hope that kind of lays the groundwork. We have resources like routes, like HTTP routes, TCP routes, and we might want to attach policy, like maybe a timeout policy or something else that affects those routes or like changes how they're actually configured, instrumented, and routed. Does that make sense to does anybody have any questions about that? Does anybody
Is
have
it
any
the same
questions?
person?
Go ahead.
I'm gathering from this, it's two different people. One person owns the route and a different person associates the policy with the route, and perhaps a third person writes the policies?
Generally, yeah. I mean, the idea is we have this concept of different roles in Gateway API, and I think it doesn't have to be, but most of the time somebody is creating policies and like associating them with, let's just for the sake of argument say it's associating with every route in a namespace or something like that, in such a way that that role is distinct from somebody who's like the application developer making the route. So one of the problems we have today that I think we highlighted it somewhere in this GEP, hopefully. There's a bunch of stuff in this GEP about the problems, but like one of them is, as an application developer, I may create an HTTP route. I have no idea that I'm being immediately affected by some policy, like let's say a timeout. And so that creates this disconnect and also problems for users and stuff like that. And potentially there are some ways in which this can be very harmful in like a production setting, like say if somebody drops a policy all of a sudden, wide burst. Sorry, any more questions before I go on? Or does that answer your question?
Almost. I was about to ask. So in OpenShift, we have a similar concept. There's someone who manages, say, a router configuration, and that router configuration has an impact on every route that is exposed via that router. And so representing in status or somewhere for a person who owns the route to know that someone turned on HSTS for them is kind of critically important. Is the policy API that you're talking about trying to resolve that as well, or is that the part you said we haven't solved yet at the beginning here?
It's similar. The problems we haven't solved, actually, policy is, I think I missed this and I apologize. Policy in our sense is actually guidelines for how to make these kind of APIs, because we didn't want to leave it completely, we didn't want every user to go between different gateway API implementations and have like no idea, like everything works completely differently. So we're trying to create some specification. There's actually a spec, but it's meant to be kind of like, use this as your core, but you have your own CRDs, if that makes sense. That might change in the future. We might eventually have policies if we can get this to standard, which we have to solve the discoverability problems for.
Okay, I'll go with it
pause
from here.
again. Okay. Please do just keep interrupting me. As I understood it, I don't think there's any other topics on the agenda, but I don't want to keep everybody. So what was I thinking? I gotta catch up with my thoughts.
I had one question. So when you said
Yeah.
people create their own CRDs, you mean they create they define a new type of policy, or is that something else?
Yeah, they might have their own policies that have no bearing on like no other implementation might have, but we want them to follow a common struct, basically.
Okay.
That's where it's at today. It's got a lot of problems and we're aware of it. That's why it's an experimental, but it also has a lot of value. So getting to kind of, I have questions for this group. And I'll pair the first thing that led to me putting this on the agenda was I had a discussion with a guy named Flynn who works on the mesh side of Gateway API with me, where we were feeling really strongly that you should be able to see any policy that affects you in the resource that you retrieve. That feels more, it's not the right word necessarily, but declarative. At the very least, it's more clear. And one of the things that I'd thought of that I wanted to at least run by you guys. So two things. I want to run it by a vague idea, and I really just want it to be a fire starter for conversation. And then what we really want is, and this is when I say we, I mean Rob Scott, Nick Young, and myself, the maintainers of Gateway API, is help, maybe feedback on what might be better approaches. But the idea that I'd came up with, which was really bombastic, I think that's the right word, like just really, it's a lot and it would take a lot to do, was that maybe meta resources could actually be something that exists in the API, like in the Kubernetes API, that you could make it possible to do a kubectl get on a resource, and in the response, much like spec or status or metadata, you could get meta resources and see which ones you're being affected by in that view. How insane is that idea?
That sounds pretty insane to me. The fan out seems wide. The fan out seems wide. Yeah. I would start asking questions like if I did a get on services, would a meta resource to a service be my endpoints? Would a meta resource to my endpoints be pods?
I'm not gonna say no.
So the fan out starts to worry me when we do that, because
the implications are pretty deep.
It's pretty broad, right? Figure out which resources to check, figure out which resources map. How do we perform that mapping? How many layers deep do we go?
I get that. Yeah, I'm not oblivious to the how complicated it might be to implement such a thing, or at least how time consuming. But do you think there's value there, given that, I don't know about you all, but for anybody who's doing production Kubernetes stuff, this kind of general idea of there being objects referencing each other all over the place is very common?
Shane, I have a question. Sorry,
sure.
This is Leila. I was a few minutes, 2-3 minutes late, and I didn't understand the use case for this. So We want to have some policy attachment at a finer granularity. So it is more than like a coarse-grained policy that apply to entire resource, but you want at different level within the resource to have a policy. And my question is, doesn't this limit the reusability of it? Adding complexity here is a lot, maintaining that policies, and then what is the with the maintenance overhead and everything, and the security risks that is implied with that, and the impact on the performance? What do we get here? Explain to me a use case that is this is useful for that. Sorry, thank you.
Sure. As a user, when I look at a resource in Kubernetes with kubectl I want to be able to see all of the resources that are other Kubernetes resources that affect it, that impact its configuration, so that I know what, in this case, what network policies are applied to it.
Okay, so you want to create a graph or a DAG of like how these resources are referred to each other in different kind of resources. So, so is it necessary to have a policy attachment there? Can we do that with some kind of labeling or another kind of like solution? I'm just thinking.
I'm open to all possibilities. That was my some conversation. I was pretty sure when I said it that it was a little too much, but yes, I'm open to suggestions here. But what I mean, ideally, I would like to see kubectl okay, here's my HTTP route. Here are the policies that are applying to me. Okay, I have a timeout policy. Great. That's the ideal situation. And my thinking with something that was at the API level came mostly from the fact that I think this kind of referencing stuff is happening everywhere in Kubernetes today, like just all over the place.
Yeah, so we have historically said if you want to be able to do something like run a GraphQL query, find all reachable things from my thing, you would push it all to a different data store and issue that query. You're right, it isn't new, right? This has existed since we had pods plus events and wrote describe, right? And we have chosen to solve that client side because it greatly simplifies the concerns about fan out, the concerns about having to get information A before getting information B, so you end up with high latency. It resolves problems around authorization. Is a user allowed to see all the things that are influencing this choice? And so our API server is very much you can see the thing that you have. And if you want to use that information to get something else, you absolutely can. We might even give you a pointer to it inside the resource that you read. But you do.
I'm open to the suggestion that meta resources from a resources viewpoint would be pointers. Like, here's the type, namespace name.
So there are ways to structure an API where you would be able to do that. I don't think right now I would be in favor of trying to expand the notion of I want to do a get and then get the things related to this thing because of the concerns around fan out and permissions and the depth of how far you go.
I understand that. So where we are at today, basically, we're pushing forward in two fronts. Client side, which is actually something you kind of mentioned. We actually have a gateway cuddle, which is meant to help with this. It's not a perfect solution. It's not going to end up being a ubiquitous thing that people will, I mean, it could, I guess, but we could plug in it or something. But we also don't want to do things only through cuddle. That's why we were thinking more at like the API level was a possibility. And status. We're investing more in status and like a cuddle for now as we consider it a stopgap measure. A stopgap measure for figuring this out.
Why would a status region with external references be purely a stopgap, right? Like that seems like a pretty reasonable way to structure. I have these other things that I suggest you look at, or I suggest you have this query. You think about when you read a service and you get back the label selector. It's natural to then say, you know, hey, I want to get the pod associated with this.
At least in its current state, I think it's because it's kind of, we just haven't gotten the specification down like very well, and we're trying to get something that's rough in time for our GA, which is supposed to be within a couple months here. Because again, these are not our CRDs, but we want this guidance in place as soon as we can. You're not wrong though. Like, I guess it was too much to say that it is that using status in general is a stopgap. We just have a stopgap solution today. I think that if we had some really good rules written up, maybe status ends up being what we do. I would hope for better, but maybe we could, you know, I would hope for something other than status for a variety of reasons, but it's not a terrible solution. And sometimes you can't have a perfect one. So that might end up being the long term. I'd like to try to think about potential alternatives, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had two thoughts. One was for the feature in beta now called validating admission policies, we kind of made this problem easier for ourselves because we do have this problem where somebody can define how a policy is applied in the custom resource. And the way that we make those findable is that there is a standard type called like a validating admission policy binding that sits between the policy rules and how they're bound. And so there is a known object that you can go and probe and say, like, find all the policy bindings that match this to that. And that gives you a way to find stuff. It sounds like part of your problem here is that it could be any CRD. So I don't even know where to look to see where the references to my thing are. But if you had like a linking object that said like, this binds this policy to these things, that might, but it introduces a new object. So I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. It's just something that came to mind.
Is there precedent for that pattern?
Yeah, validating admission policy is the one that
Or
I
you
can,
just
and
told me
then
there was,
roles are also that. You have role bindings.
Roger that. Yeah, role bindings. Okay. Okay. Maybe that's the way to go. A way to go and think about.
It's definitely one I would like consider in the alternative list.
Okay. I'll note that
Another similar thing that we have in OpenShift, types that have on status a field called related objects. We have client-side tools that look and say, oh, you have a related objects. I know that this means whatever you listed here is a thing that I should look up. If you have permissions to do it, I will pull it. And if you do a command, not a get, but you do an inspect, I will actually client-side go out and get it again. And get the next piece. And so that solves the fan out problem by having the client actually do the request, and same for the authorization problem. And then they are nestable because you can have one object that has related objects. You go out and get that one, and that one also has related objects, and you sort of chain yourself out. It's a pattern that has worked pretty decently.
I appreciate whoever's taking notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also think it's for some things status might be appropriate. I just don't know the use cases well enough, but I can think of some cases where you would just want to look and you don't even really care where something came from. Sometimes you just care like what's happening. And so the status is a good way
effect
to
can be, putting the actual effect in the status when possible is solid.
Exactly. Yeah. And I realize that doesn't solve your whole problem, but.
Okay. Well, these are a couple of interesting things for me to think about. My co-maintainers, I think, wanted to come to one of these too. So I guess my last question, I have one last question, and then I'm willing to be kind of done and take some time and go think about these and go talk with Nick and Rob a little bit about it. And then we'll probably come back to one of these in the future as we continue working on this. I actually want, like, does anybody like really hate the idea that I threw out though? I mean, like, I'm not convinced of it, but like, is the idea that you could just do a get and you would have something like meta resources and you could see that on, not worrying about the implications or the implementation details, that actually sound good? Or does it sound like, nah, that's not something that would really be helpful in my world where I have resources referencing and affecting other resources? Or if you don't know.
I think that on balance, the trade-off is likely to bring more pain than good, right? Because the next thing that will be required is filtering on it, because so many things can impact what is. Imagine a pod. Think about all the things that impact pods. You have CSI drivers, you have node status, you have RBAC permissions, you have network policy. And so your list of these things interact with my pod is so broad that the next thing that comes is, well, I need to be able to filter it. Well, filter by what? And that ignores even the likelihood of should you even be allowed to see the names of whatever it is you're using. I don't know. And then how transitive does it need to be, right? So, you know, my CSI driver is dependent upon some other entity working, and so it has yet another related item. Does it transitively roll up all the way to the top, or is it one layer deep? And then so with questions like that, then the conceptual usability of such an API, I think, comes into question, right? Because in the case that you have, you know, well, you're interested in policies. By the time you add related resources on this thing, onto a route, for instance, I would expect that HTTP route to reference things like services or endpoints or pods, and you go transitively down, now you're referencing nodes. And what you really wanted was show me the policies that are impacting this route. And so I think it'd be better to target the individual problem.
Yeah, okay. That's good thoughts. And I mean, I kind of know these things. Like, I'm in the back of my head, these are thoughts that I've had. I know it's a little quixotic, so I have plenty to go on for like what I needed. I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for the conversation. If anybody wants to ask me more questions or continue the conversation, I'm happy to, but I'm good to kind of digest this for now. Come back later.
I want to make sure I didn't stop anybody else from offering their opinion on those fields. Just give them a second.
Yeah, I didn't see any hands, but go for it.
Okay. Okay, doesn't sound like it. So.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shane, and you're welcome to come back, you know, when you have more thoughts or bring more people. Thank you. Very
Sounds
good.
good.
I guess that was the big topic today. And then, Joe, did you want to take this one quickly for the...
Yeah, this is just a really quick announcement. I mean, whenever we finish a Kubernetes release, the next one's coming really quick. So 1.29, we're going to be going up against enhancement freeze in no time. I actually didn't look up the date. Maybe if somebody has time, they can tell us. That'd be great. But it's coming quick. If you are planning to do an enhancement in the release, it would be very much appreciated if you would tell us what you're thinking of doing. You can do it on Slack. If you know now, you can do it. And then also try and line up your reviewers so that we can make sure we can anticipate load and can distribute load of all the things that need to be reviewed. So identify somebody in leads that you think would be appropriate. Reach out to us. We love to hear from people before they send us a KEP that they're going to send us a KEP, because then we can kind of be ready. That's it.
Yes, echoing what Joe is saying, like we have a very limited pool of people that can actually go through things, so planification in advance is the way to go. Otherwise, it's really hard. It hits all the same group of people very hard every time we get to the freezes. Very good. I will just mention that we did submit a 1-minute intro video for the next KubeCon in an incredible display of my technical abilities to record videos. There is a 17-page instruction tutorial how to record the video in the right way. So we'll see if we make it. Anyways, And that's all for today. I will upload the recording later in the channel. We'll share with the SIG, and we'll see you in the next 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Have a good day.